Boy, Deacon Rick had a pretty high bar set for him after those two readings from our Holy Trinity students this morning, huh? What a beautiful job. What a beautiful. Of the few TV shows that I've gotten into over the past few years, one of them that I've really enjoyed is Stranger Things, which is a Netflix series that's been popular since it first came out in 2016. And I assume that many of you, if not probably most of you, are familiar with it in some regard. Personally, kind of a sucker for the whole 80s nostalgia, coming of age genre, so it was right up my alley. If you're not familiar with the show, it's somewhat ridiculously complicated, so I'm not going to try to explain it in any great depth, but the basic premise here is that it's kind of a sci-fi story about a town in Indiana where a rift into another dimension has been opened by these kind of secret government scientists. And when the main characters, who are a bunch of middle school kids, pass through this wormhole of sorts, they discover that what awaits them on the other side is sort of an identical version of their own town, of their own reality, except at the same time, it's completely different. Everything is dark and ominous. There's an empty feeling to the world. There's all sorts of evil creatures lurking around. And the kids call this parallel world the Upside Down. The Upside Down, basically to suggest that this new dimension resembles their current world, but everything is kind of turned on its head. And the directors of the show, they imply this even with their camera work and the editing that they do. Whenever switching back and forth between scenes happening in the real world and scenes happening in the upside down world, the camera will kind of pan through the floor, through the ground, in order to show this mirrored and upside down world on the other side, which is darker, spookier than the world that the main characters inhabit. It's very well done. Anyway, I bring this up because something that you'll oftentimes hear people say about Jesus is that he comes to the earth, he is incarnate among men in order to turn the world upside down, to turn the world upside down. And you know what, when you hear something like today's gospel, the Beatitudes, it's easy to understand why people might say this about Jesus. A world where the poor, the self-giving, the meek, the merciful, those who lament of their own sinfulness, the persecuted, a world where all of those people are considered the most favored, is certainly a world that seems upside down, at least compared to our usual experience of the world. And it certainly isn't only Christians who have made this observation, right? Think about those in society who perhaps push against Christ and his church, maybe those who are even militantly against religion. Might they say the same thing about Jesus, that he turns the world upside down? To many, we as Christians, followers of Jesus, are considered upside down, backwards, regressive, antithetical to the ways of the world. And hey, there's at least some truth there, right? Christians are oftentimes antithetical to the ways of the world. I'll certainly cede to that accusation, but at the same time, look at the ways of the world. Look at what is happening specifically in Western civilization. In a million different ways, modern, so-called enlightened man has skewed the natural order through kind of this horrible, all these horrible postmodern ideas that really seek to redefine mankind and mankind's purpose. We exalt things like money and power and pride and fleeting pleasures, although we know that such pursuits are really against our best interests, but we chase after them anyway. As Christians, I think that we should be happy to stand as antithetical to such a world where might makes right and cash rules everything, a world where nihilism and subjective morality are kind of the standard operating procedures. If pushing back against these awful things is considered a sin against progress, then I think that we should be more than happy to be called regressive. Because here's the thing. In a secular world where up is down and left is right and right is wrong, can we really say that what opposes it, the moral worldview taught to us by Jesus, is upside down? Can we really say that? Rather, would it not be truer to say that we're looking at things from the wrong perspective? Would it not be truer to say that the world that Jesus invites us into is actually the world as it should be, right side up? Jesus doesn't come to turn a right side up world upside down. He comes to turn an upside down world right side up. The gloomy and misty, kind of spooky world of Stranger Things is not the world that's been touched by the life and teaching of Jesus. It's the world that chooses to believe that the life and teaching of Jesus are inconsequential. In our first reading today from the prophet Zephaniah, we hear God refer to his people as a remnant, a remnant. This is a common concept in the Old Testament. You'll hear this come up a lot. This idea, the idea being that out of love for his people and out of faithfulness to the covenants that God establishes with his people, God will always preserve this remnant, this contingency of people, however small, who seek to follow God's commands and accomplish his will, no matter what the rest of society is doing. No matter how much the rest of the culture has kind of gone off the deep end, so to speak, be it through idol worship or through mistreatment of the poor, as we hear constantly is happening in a lot of the prophetic literature in the Bible, maybe sexual sin or anything of the sort. Despite all that, the remnant will remain. The remnant will remain. You know, we think we have our issues today in this society, in this world, but as we, of course, hear in Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun, right? Nothing new under the sun, as David Byrne in the Talking Heads once said, same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. The default setting of humanity in a fallen world is to rebel against God, to push back against God. The default setting for us in this fallen world is sin, anger, misery. It's the remnant that is meant to stand apart from that default setting, to serve as a witness to God's love and fidelity and the peace and the joy that come alongside faithfulness to God. In our second reading today, St. Paul tells us something incredible. He tells us that this idea of the remnant, this small remnant of people, this faithful remnant, it doesn't end in the Old Testament. It carries into the New. It carries into the New, except now, who is the faithful remnant? Who is meant to give witness to God in an upside-down world? We are. We are. We are the remnant, the church. Those baptized into Christ Jesus are the remnant. This is inherent to our baptism. We can choose, of course, to reject this invitation, but we can't deny that it's been offered to us. What does St. Paul say to the church at Corinth in the second reading? Consider your calling. Consider your own calling. These are the words that are meant for not just the community that Paul was addressing in this letter. This is addressed to all of us, the entire church today. Consider your calling. Consider that you are the remnant. You are meant to be the witnesses of God's love and fidelity in this upside-down world. You are meant to stand apart. Unless any of us get prideful and think, oh, look at me, I'm so great. God's called me to be part of the remnant. That must mean that I'm better than everybody else. No. St. Paul puts a quick stop to that, right? What does he say? He says, not many of you are wise by human standards. Not many are powerful. Not many of noble birth. Rather, God chooses the foolish of the world to shame the wise. God chooses the weak of the world to shame the strong. God chooses the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something, so that no human might boast in anything but God. In other words, we're chosen to be part of the remnant not because we are worthy, but because in the eyes of the world, we are unworthy. Not because we're strong, but because in the eyes of the world, we are weak. As a matter of fact, just about the only prerequisite to being a part of the remnant is to understand that you are nothing apart from God, that everything you are, everything that you have, everything that you desire is anchored in God alone. The remnant is not meant to be some kind of prideful arbiter of moral judgment, this kind of elite and exclusive club that just kind of points a stern finger at everyone else's wrongdoing. The remnant rather exists to show the world that God is love, that God is joy, that God is the antidote for an upside-down world. And if we choose to live our lives as saints, as upright people in an upside-down world, we will experience the fullness of God's love and joy, not just in now, but also in the world to come, in the life to come. And guess what, everybody? If you haven't already realized this, I'm sure you have, being part of the remnant is tough. It's hard. It's really dang hard. If it's not, you're probably not doing it right. It takes energy to stand up, stand right side up when the world wants to flip you head over heels constantly. Take the Beatitudes, for instance. What does the word beatitude mean? It just means happiness, right? This is Jesus' roadmap to happiness that he presents us today. Go around preaching to people, tell people that the way to experience untold riches in this life is through poverty, that the way to experience strength is through meekness, that the path to power is through humility and servitude, that the way to conquer is through peace. This kind of thinking will get you laughed at. It gets you laughed at. I remember when I was a young friar, back probably in my early 20s, I used to volunteer each week at a juvenile detention center. And I had teenagers, significantly younger than me, I had teenagers laughing at me when I told them that I would feel richer without belongings than I ever would if I were to own a Mercedes or something like that. They were scandalized by the fact that I wouldn't even desire such a thing. They were scandalized by the idea that I would feel freer under obedience to God than I ever would if I were left to my own corrupt whims. The people of Assisi laughed at St. Francis in his day, this wealthy young man who gave up everything so he could wear rags, so he could do penance, pray, beg for his food. But he didn't do all this to just make a clown show of himself, right? To draw attention to himself. He did it to point to God. He did it because he knew that he was part of the remnant. He knew that the Beatitudes are how we order ourselves towards happiness, rather than through the traditional ideas that even existed in Francis's time, right? Of power and wealth. And he wanted to show people that it was God that led to happiness, not those corrupt ideas. And being part of the remnant, of course, won't just get us laughed at. It will lead us to being hated. It really will, and I mean that sincerely. To stand before our upside-down world and to say that our lives are not our own, that we're meant for a greater purpose than mere pleasure and physical gratification. Well, that can practically be seen as insulting people's religious beliefs these days. To stand before our upside-down world and to say that every single human life has dignity, no matter how small, no matter how weak, and that we stand in solidarity with the poor and weak of the world. Well, to say that can lose you your job these days. It'll get you kicked off of social media platforms. To stand before our upside-down world and say that we as fallen humans are prone to sin and that we need God's grace, well, that could get you the silent treatment at Thanksgiving dinner, right? But blessed are the persecuted. Blessed are the persecuted. It's necessary to stand before our upside-down world and proclaim precisely these things, not because we're judging others, not because we view ourselves as the moral superiors to everyone else, but because we know that the path to joy comes through God alone, from understanding our worth and our purpose, not in accepting corrupt ideas of how we can be happy, or a utilitarian view of our humanity, or a subjective understanding of our own dignity, that's upside down world stuff. That's upside down world stuff. With God's grace, let's turn it right side up. Brothers and sisters, we are the remnant, not because we're strong, but because our weakness shows that God is strong. Not because we're perfect, but because we know that only God is perfect. We don't think that we're better than anyone else. At least I certainly hope we don't. We sure shouldn't. We're just blessed with the calling that comes through our baptism. It's a calling that's open to every single person on this earth. It's a calling that demands that we act as witnesses to God's goodness, that we show others that the way out of this upside-down world is the life of beatitude. It's a life of following Jesus, even when it appears hard or counterintuitive. It's the life of the saints who rebelled against the standard operating procedure and chose to live upright lives. This world is upside down. Jesus shows us a world that is right side up. It's a world that seems contrary to everything we believe in this society. And perhaps the most contrary thing of all is that God would use us, weak and imperfect as we are, to show others the path to happiness. We are the remnant, not because we're extra awesome, but because God is, and it's in His name that we boast.